Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Prophetic Habits, the podcast about the daily habits of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in order for us to live optimally in the 21st century. Alhamdulillah, today we have a special guest, a Seekers Guidance family member and a dear brother and colleague here in Cape Town, South Africa, Sidi Jamaaludeen Khan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sidi.
Walaikum salam. I'm so happy to be here. Alhamdulillah.
Barakallahu feekum. And Sidi Jamaaludeen has agreed to come on to this particular episode with myself in order for us to really get into time management. Oh, I said myself without explaining. So this is an audio and video podcast. Irshad Siddiq, Seekers Guidance, the Global Islamic Seminary. And we are going to look at this topic in amazing detail today, both at the micro level as well as at the macro level. So don't go away and stay till the end, inshallah ta'ala, and there's much benefit to be taken. Barakallahu feekum.
So there's a hadith that's related in Ibn Majah where the Prophet ﷺ said, "O Allah, bless my nation in their early mornings." Right? Now, the early mornings is a time of barakah. Right, it's a time of blessings. So I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with scholars from both locally and scholars from other countries, and I've never seen a scholar sleep after Fajr before the sun rises. Right, I'd always actually see them in ibadah during that time. Right, so someone. Actually, a son of a scholar actually said to me, even if you don't do ibadah, right? Even if you're actually doing your work, your professional work, that's fine, but don't sleep during that time because it's a time of barakah. So this is the spiritual dimension. And for people to maybe to help people get this point, it's the same when we look at sadaqah, right? So when we give charity, if you have 100 rand or $100 and you give 1 rand or $1 away, we don't believe we have 99 left. We believe we have more than 100, right? Because of this spiritual dimension. So these two dimensions is, in my perspective, a fundamental in understanding. You first have to get that, right? And then inshallah you move from there. So but inshallah we'll converse and you can, I will respond inshallah to your cues.
Naam khair. Just in another sense of this barakah aspect, what I find important about, again, that this what we refer to as time management is that we kind of have a structure given to us already, divinely ordained, in the form of the 5 daily prayers. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very, very clear and explicit about the fact that we must pray on time. Inna salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta. Salah is fixed at prescribed times for believers. So it's not just about the fact that we must pray or the fact that we must pray in a certain way. It's also that it must be in that particular time. And what this does, if you take your prayer seriously, right? And when I say this, I mean, it's not just that I need to pray on time. I need to pray like I'm waiting for the adhan. I'm I want to be at the masjid, or for example, I want to just, like, I know my parents and their parents and people back when I was growing up were always punctual for salah. Like, they are waiting for the adhan. The radio is on, 5 minutes before, and they're waiting for the adhan. So they would pray at the beginning of its waqt. Now, what that does on a very practical level, and I suppose I can only assume at the barakah level as well, is regulate one's life. So you start building your life around that. Now, I'm not saying we do it, but I've seen it being done and I've seen it working very well. So often for people who are punctual like that, they now govern their day from one waqt to the next. So they know, okay, between Fajr and Dhuhr, That's how my energy levels are. That's how I generally feel at that time. Usually, I am able to get so much work done. I have to make sure that I'm there by that time. If I don't, then I'm falling behind. And they also know the same thing about between Dhuhr and Asr. They know that, okay, at that time of the day, I feel this way. I need to eat. Like they just have this pattern and it just works for them. And that was so important to them that often I recall my grandfather, rahimahullah, often asking before leaving the home, before agreeing to go somewhere with someone, because he didn't drive. So he would jump in somebody else's car. Before agreeing, he would first ask, how long is it going to take us to get there? Because he wanted to know, am I going to be able to pray on time?
Yeah.
You know, that type of thing.
Yeah.
It was crazy. Like, and that's how they lived. And they were very productive. They were very effective. They were spiritual people, right? So I think there's a built-in system of, call it time management, call it time, whatever you want to call it, but there's a system of regulation that has sort of been given to us. What's your take on this and like really using the 5 salahs beyond just, okay, you need to pray at that time, but also as sort of markers during your day?
So I have a lot to add
Bismillah.
from what you've just said. So firstly, yes, I agree that the 5 daily prayers should be a sort of compass for our day to determine how we manage our day. Now, this is not unique. Other people do this with other things in their life. Sometimes they manage the entire day around their business. Some people would manage the entire day around their family, right? So another thing I've witnessed with scholars visiting South Africa from overseas, it's very different when a visiting scholar comes and you go to the masjid to a lecture, right? Because that's the public, quote unquote, performance, right? But when you spend the personal time with them, you get to see their habits and you get to notice trends. And one thing I've noticed is that when a scholar arrives, the first thing that they want is the prayer times. So initially, when I was quite young, I would see this happening, but I wasn't sure what was going on because I just see a piece of paper. And then you'd see the sheikh actually studying the piece of paper, right? Then I realized it's the salah times for that day in that week, right? So I like the word that you used, regulate, right? So we regulate our day based on the prayer times, right? So and another point beyond that is that you mentioned about noting how you feel and how productive you are at different times of the day, right? So there are people in the Western world. So there's something, for example, called the 5 a.m. Club, right? Initiated by an author who I've met, who I respect, but I don't necessarily feel that that's for everyone, right? But I say that with sort of a caveat that as Muslims, the morning is important for the spiritual dimension, right? So that time you should not be asleep, I believe, for productivity and physical productivity and spiritual barakah. But I don't believe you should follow any necessary routine in your worldly affairs. You should actually do things on a schedule that is most productive to you, when you're in a state of flow, right? And then what you mentioned about the salah times and the people, our grandparents, etc. I remember in my 20s, I was studying Quran with Imam Kashif Basadin of Kensington. I don't know if you know him. And he was
You
telling
said in your 20s. It's like 5 years ago.
no, a bit more than that. So actually it might have been in my late teens, but anyway, so he was telling us about his aunt, an aunt of his, who throughout his life, he saw that she would be on her musalla when the adhan was
Sure.
heard. There would never be any time that you heard the adhan and she was not sitting already,
Sure.
right? So, um, so early on, I talked about this nexus, right, where Islamic sciences and our Islamic teachings meet with behavioral science and psychology, etc. Now, I met someone in the army once, right? Sorry, I met him in business, but he was ex-army.
Mm.
So he had come from the army world, and he said to me, in the army, there's a philosophy that if you're on time, you're late, and if you're early, then you're on time. And that's what that lady was doing, right? So, inshallah, before we go on, I'll just mention one small but yet important thing, that beyond time management, I believe that the rituals and rules in Islam are more than what we see on the surface,
Right.
right? There's much more meaning that we can extract. So, just quickly, I'll mention that, for example, the prayer, we have to pray 5 times a day, right? And that's a very important thing. But the times change, right? It's not the same time every single day, right? So we can take from that a principle and a lesson that even things that are the most important sometimes change, and we need some flexibility in things. Then there are there are rules for traveling, for example, right? So when you're traveling, according to which madhab you follow, you can shorten and combine prayers. So that teaches us that in normal life, we should understand that when certain conditions are met, sometimes things can change. They don't need to always stay the same. And so this is, beyond the time management subject, but this is something that I'm really interested in looking at. What are the possible deeper meanings of the injunctions of Islam to help us in everyday life? Because we're most of us are not scholars, so we're not in the scholar world, and most of us and all of us in South Africa at least are not in an Islamic land, right? So we're we're living a quote unquote normal life outside of an Islamic per se environment. So how do we use what Islam offers us to a relevant extent in our lives?
طيب Sadi, so we're speaking about time management and self-management and barakah and so on. Let's get into the tactics. Let's get into the actual action plan that we can set for ourselves, that we can improve on the measurables. Bismillah.
Okay, so my first advice for anyone listening is take a pen or on your device, mobile or laptop device, and write down your roles. What roles do you have? Right? So you might be a father, you might be a wife, a daughter, whatever your roles are in life. And we all have several roles, right? You might be a cousin, you might be a nephew, you might be an uncle. So write down all your roles. And then write down next to each role what your current priorities are, right? What are the most important things that you need to do or attend to in each of those roles, right? So let's take one step back. Why is this important? It's important because we have to live a balanced life, right? And balance doesn't mean that you have to spend 50% of time on one thing and 50% of time on another thing. Balance means that I'll use the definition of wisdom which the scholars use. They say wisdom is giving everything its due, right? In proportion. So, when we look at all our roles, we'll see that we have priorities in some of them, but not in all of them. So maybe as a nephew, right? So you might have an uncle, right? So you're the nephew. As your nephew role, you might not have anything that you really need to do right now. So there's no real priorities now. So that's fine, right? But as an uncle, because you might have a niece and a nephew, as an uncle, you might have certain priorities that you need to take care of, right? So if you do not do it this way, you will focus only on priorities that come, that seem urgent to you, that are top of mind, but you might be neglecting other roles in your life, right? So you first start with the roles, then you look at your priorities per role, and then you schedule your priorities, right? So you can't do everything at once. And there's also your daily routines that you need to do. So for example, Sheikh Irshad, if I can show you my laptop right now, I have in my calendar an hour for iftar scheduled
Ajib.
and 2 hours for tarawih scheduled.
Nice.
Because that block time, there's nothing else I can do in that time. So I have to block it. I have to schedule it, right? So when we know what our priorities are vis-a-vis the roles that we have, now we can schedule what we need to do as well, right? Now, on a day-to-day basis, things come up, right? So things that we don't expect.
Yes.
So we cannot really evaluate productivity on a day-to-day basis simply because of the nature of life. So a day is too short and a month is too long, right? So the sweet spot for what is called a weekly review is based on a 7-day cycle, right? So my advice to people is know your roles, understand your priorities per role, and then schedule your priorities.
Right.
Right? So like I said, as a nephew, you might not have any priorities, so there's nothing to schedule. There's nothing to do. Right? But as an uncle, you might have a priority and you might have to schedule that. Right? And then each week you review, okay, how did I do the past week? And what do I need to do for the coming week, right? So in that way, we'll feel like we're on top of things. So what I find is that most people have anxiety about things they need to do.
Yeah.
Right? So, but it's an anxiety that
those important nagging things that we want, that we know we procrastinate on, those things.
Yes. And so people walk around with it during the day. They go to bed with that anxiety and they wake up with that anxiety, right? And it's not laziness, right? So the challenge is that we don't have a system, we don't have a plan, and we don't have a clean look at what all needs to be done in a realistic fashion, right? So it's all in our head. We know we need to do a whole lot of stuff, but it's all in our head. And that's why people often struggle, and it causes actual anxiety. And many times, and I've experienced this personally myself, many times we delay something for months and it ends up taking us 12 minutes sometimes to do, or it takes us 2 hours, but it took us months to get to actually doing it, right? And that's really not necessary. So So planning and then executing on your plan is the way out.
I want to jump in here. There's a few things that sort of leaps out at me. The one is I really like this book called Make Time. I'm sure you've heard of it, but there's a number of strategies that it's actually a collection of strategies. It's not like this one framework of ideas. It's a collection of strategies, and then you get to choose like which one makes sense to you. But the one thing that's sort of my highlight in there is the idea of a highlight of the day. And when times are chaotic and I don't feel like, this is actually my schedule book here, I don't feel like, writing a to-do list or something of that sort, I just sort of default back to this idea that I need to have one highlight of the day. Like just one thing that I know if I accomplish that thing, I would feel or delude myself into feeling that I did well for that day. It could be anything. It could be, okay, I went for my 5K run, for example, or it could be that I spent 30 minutes playing with my daughter. It doesn't matter. It's your highlight of the day. And it's not that that's the only thing you're going to do for the day. But usually we have this bunch of things that we need to get done. We never get through all of them. And then the end of the day, we look back and it's like you don't feel like you did anything. Whereas if you have this highlight of the day and you did that one thing, then the stuff that you actually don't get around to doesn't even matter anymore. Because, you know where your day went. Oh, that's the day I spent with.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a really cool one. And another one that sort of stands out for me is Stephen Pressfield's Do the Work. He also writes The War of Art. Very, very interesting, I must say. All of these books, the New York Times bestsellers and these things, they tend to be very accessible ways of understanding things that many of our scholars have written about for centuries. And that is basically understanding the nafs. That's what it comes down to. It's really understanding the nafs, the ins and outs of it, how it works, how it can work for you, and how it will work against you. And it's really the same thing. Like Imam Ghazali, he often speaks about how we should manage ourselves during the day and how we should have a regular pattern and all these things. But here in Stephen Pressfield's book, he really, subhanAllah, he articulates it so well. He speaks about this difficulty that lies between ourselves and the important tasks in our lives. And it's generally the creative stuff, writing that piece or recording that video or finishing that article, there you find what he terms as resistance. And the more important the particular activity, the more resistance. And he does a brilliant job at analyzing the resistance, and he describes it. But more importantly, he teaches you that you should just go for the resistance. Like, understand that wherever you feel the resistance, that's the thing you should do first. That's the thing where you're going to get the most growth. That's the thing where you're going to feel the best. That's the thing that's going to relieve you of the most anxiety.
Yeah, exactly.
Go straight for it. So I really like that, and I just thought I'd share that. Inshallah.
So, alhamdulillah, so Stephen Pressfield's work is, I actually came across it through Seth Godin.
Okay.
So Seth Godin himself is a prolific author, but he's a big fan of Pressfield's work.
Right.
And what you just mentioned about facing the resistance, and before I go ahead, let me just say to people, I'm not a scholar, right? So, if I make any errors, it's all on me. But I do believe there's a saying of Sayyidina Ali where he said, face fear head on, right? So the resistance is the thing that you fear the most, even if it's just the thing that you fear the most for that day, right? And so you face that head on and you get it out the way, and you always realize that it wasn't so bad after all, right? And another thing is that you spoke about one highlight for the day, right? Now, if it's something that you enjoyed, but it wasn't the biggest priority or urgent matter for the day, you will still feel like it was a good day, right? But that is why your weekly review should be done on a weekly basis, because your priorities for that day still need to get done. Even if you didn't do it, but you just did your highlight, you maybe went for your run, etc. So maybe you'll catch up and you'll do it the next day, right? So this concept of catching up is also found in Islam, right? So you shouldn't miss the prayer. So one scholar was asked about this, and he said there's no such thing as qada, right? But there is, but he was being slightly dramatic to express that you shouldn't really miss the prayer, right? But if you do miss the prayer, you can make it up. If you miss the fast, you can make it up, right? So this weekly review allows us to make up what we've missed, but we still need to get things done, right? And I think that's important. But this is short term. So I'd like to switch gears a bit.
Bismillah.
Right? What we're talking about is our day-to-day time management and day-to-day productivity practices, right? So those are important. However, we should, as a Muslim community, think about long-term achievements, right? As a community, but also in our individual lives and our family lives.
Absolutely.
Right? So here is something that I want to read that is very important to think about. And it's also from a book. The book is called The Long View by Matthew Kelly. And it says, most people overestimate what they can do in a day and underestimate what they can do in a month. Right? And then he goes further and he says, we overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. Right? So this is,
that's so true, man. Sure.
Yeah. So I've got this under the heading of slow productivity, right? So I'm busy compiling data and research on this topic at the moment. And it's about working towards something that's not urgent, but it will have high impact when accomplished, right? So sometimes people take years to write a book, for example.
Yes.
Right? And I just listened to a podcast recently of an author who took about 6 years to write a book because she had 2 kids in the same time as well. So what I would advise our dear listeners to think about is, what have you underestimated that you can do in a month, in a year, and in a decade? Right? Because we often don't think that far ahead.
True.
Right?
True. We don't. Yeah.
So we're very used to cramming. So what he says is we overestimate what we can do in a day. Now, many people, if you ask them in the morning to show you their to-do lists, it's a very long list.
Right.
And it's highly, highly, highly unlikely that they'll get through that list during that one day.
Of course. Of
Right?
course.
Because that's what we do. We overestimate what we can do in a day. Right? But if you look at what you can do this month, big items that you can accomplish in this month, and then have a scheduled plan across the month of how to achieve that. And same for a decade. First same for a year, and then also same for a decade. And I think few of us think about this slow productivity and what we really want to achieve. So I have a friend who, he's a businessman, but he enjoys DIY stuff.
Right.
So he made he didn't call it this, but he had a slow productivity goal to build a garden, right? But what he did was, and this was pre-COVID, so he used to work in his office and then you'd arrive home, and his routine was that before he does anything at home, before he changes his clothing, before he eats, before he does anything, he will work for only 15 minutes in his garden. So he did that every day consistently for 1 year. And after 1 year, he had a very big, very beautiful garden.
Ajib.
Right? That's slow productivity. So, and again, so
you should, I don't know if he's willing to share, but you should share some photos. It would be like nice. You mentioned this.
I should ask him. He posted them online, so I'll actually ask him if he has, a step by step.
That would be great.
Yeah, I'll ask him, inshallah. So, but this is in line with what the Prophet ﷺ spoke about consistency, right? The hadith that, even if a deed is small, if it's done consistently, that's better, right? So many of us want to do a big thing, but we do it once and never again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this slow productivity, this
tough.
Consistency is important.
It's tough. It's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah.
I recently submitted my master's. I think I took 4 years to submit the master's. There were times, there were literally months where I did nothing. Like months and months and months went by, and it was just this looming thing, this anxiety that you spoke about. You go to sleep, you wake up, you go to the bathroom, you come out of the bathroom, you go to a holiday, you come home from holiday. You're always stressed out about it because it's this thing that you're supposed to do, but you don't feel like doing it and you don't want to do it, but you have to do it and you're going to have to do it and and you're running out of time. It's terrible. And what I found was that when I was working, I decided enough of this now. I'm going to forget about the actual masters. I'm going to forget about the quality of the masters. I'm going to forget about the achievements. I'm going to forget about my external examiners because I had really high profile external examiners and I was worried about what they were going to say. I'm going to forget about my supervisors. I'm just going to forget about everything. All I'm doing is I'm dedicating 1 hour a day, every single day, to the masters. And even if I sit there and I do nothing, but I'm just looking at words, but I'm not doing something else. I'm not deliberately procrastinating by doing something else. As long as I do that, I'm good. And I finished my masters.
MashaAllah. So
it was crazy. It was almost silly how simple it was to do that. But yet it was one of the most difficult things I've ever done.
So a few things here. When you were procrastinating and it was not scheduled, that itself brought anxiety.
Yes.
Right? So at the moment, you and I are not worried. We do not have anxiety about the Asr prayer. Because we know it has a schedule. It'll arrive at a certain time.
Yes.
Right? Now, when we have things to do and we have no schedule and no plan for them, that in itself causes anxiety. But once it's in a schedule, the anxiety drops because we know when that time comes, it'll get done. Right? And then the only thing we need is the discipline to execute.
Yeah.
Right? And then what you mentioned about with your master spending 1 hour a day, right? This was actually the habit of a prolific author, Neil Gaiman, right?
Okay.
Where he would, was more than 1 hour a day, but he would force himself to sit at the place where he wrote. I think it was at the back of his house. And he could do nothing during that time or write.
Wow.
Right? So if he chose not to write, he could sit and do nothing.
Yeah.
But he was not allowed to do anything else.
Yes.
So he could not read, he could not fidget with anything. He just had to sit there or write.
Right.
And he said that he would very quickly come to the conclusion that writing is more enjoyable than not doing anything. So
Yeah.
he would write. And it's this structured discipline of knowing that time is for that thing, right? So, you know, all of us, I myself have forgotten, at one stage or another to put my phone off before going into the masjid, right? But these are actually opportunities to disconnect. So we have, so that, 1.5, 2 hours for Taraweeh right now as we're in Ramadan, we have actually an opportunity to disconnect from everything else. So now we know, so even at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the day, we're very busy, and, you might be working and have a live stream playing on YouTube from Makkah or Medina, and you wish you were there, right? But at least you know that tonight from, 8 to 10, I'll have my spiritual time, right? I'll be in the masjid, I'll be, with the jama'ah, and I will be totally disconnected from anything else that's trivial.
That's profound.
We segment our time, right? So, so there's, you very well know the hadith about the presence in the prayer, right? And now there's a whole lot of talk about mindfulness. And this has been in Islam forever, right? So everything that we do, whether it's work or, exercise or our prayer, we should be present in that, right? There's actually an entire book written about this one subject called The Power of Now, right? So Islam has all these ingredients, but we have to take the practical meanings of how we will use it in our lives, right? And you mentioned earlier a quote by Imam Ghazali. So the famous quote of Imam Ghazali is a very long one, and what I normally do with students is I deconstruct each line, right? So because reading it sounds good and feels good, but you actually have to deconstruct it to actually look at what is actually saying and how can we actually practically use it. And I normally deconstruct every line, and essentially what he's saying is that you have to have a schedule, right? You have to have a schedule and you have to be disciplined. And what he says is that if you're disciplined in one thing, there'll be barakah in your time for the rest of the day, right? So, I believe that this, morning time, before the sun rises, that's a barakah time. So if you are engaged in something good during that time and you're disciplined in that, you'll have barakah during the rest of the day.
Ayo.
Right? So, these are the spiritual dimensions. So we have to take both, right? And why I say take both, I'll give you an unrelated but extreme example, right? A friend of mine who was in high school with me, but we hadn't seen each other for many years. And I, ran into with this pre-COVID at a business function, and she said to me that she just came out of a clinic for depression, right? And so she was telling me, about her experience, etc. But she said, my mother would not visit me there, right? And she says, my mother said to me that you just have to make sujood and ask Allah to help you, right? Now, this is someone who has a lot of faith who says that, but they don't have they don't have both dimensions. So, you have to make the sujood, you have to ask Allah, but you also have to seek help, right? Same thing, your ceiling is leaking, right? Or your roof is leaking. You're going to pray to ask Allah to help you, but you're going to call, what do you call the guy who fixes the roof?
Handyman.
The handyman, right? So you're going to do both, right?
I'm just picturing some guy standing under his and his leak. So begging Allah
Exactly.
to make it that
Yeah.
subhanallah.
So, I mean, this from the Quran where Allah says, ask those who know, right? So the handyman knows about roofs and, so my point is that you have to have both, right? So like with today's complex lives, technology helps, right? Using apps helps, using a digital calendar helps. So use those things, but also understand the spiritual dimension. So for example, you can inculcate little habits. So before you do anything in your work, like before you do a podcast, before you make a call, before you send an email, recite a dua, right? You can bring the Islamic dimension into everything that you do because you're seeking barakah. Sheikh Ismail Lont, many people from Cape Town will know, he always makes that dua, oh Allah, put barakah in our time, right? Because he understands there's a difference. Like from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. without barakah, it's just 60 minutes. But 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. with barakah is maybe 10 hours.
No.
So I think that's inshallah important.
Sidi, I've taken a lot of benefit from this podcast, and I'm sincerely hoping that we can do this again. I'm sure the listeners will agree with me. I just wanna sort of summarize what we've dealt with. We looked at the idea of time management and like the fallacy of time management. What is it really? Self-management. Okay, fine. We've looked at that and the definition of that, the importance thereof, and so forth. Then we looked at individualistic strategies or atomistic strategies of how we manage our own day-to-day things and so on. And then we went into a sort of a macro time management. Like, don't forget about the long term, the end game, right? And invest into that as well. So it's really been albeit general, but quite a holistic overview of this idea of time management. I think it's only fit, the Prophet's interesting actually that the Sunnah is before parting ways to actually recite Surah Al-Asr.
Yes.
Which is a profound surah as far as time management is concerned. Well, as far as time is concerned. I think anyone who wants to know Islam's position on time management, these things, study the tafsir of that surah. It's a beautiful, incredible surah of the Quran. Just the very first word or two words, wal asr. It's an oath that God takes by time, but the word that is utilized for time there is asr as opposed to waqt or zaman, or there are a number of other words that could have been used. The nature of that word specifically is that it's squeezing out. Like juice in Arabic is asir because it's squeezed out, right? So when you say wal asr, by time, it's not just by time, it's by time that's running out. You don't have an infinite supply. It's limited. You don't know when it's going. It's like in Cape Town not too long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, we had some droughts and we were approaching what they refer to as day zero, right?
Yes.
And this was like, I don't know, it was like a thing, everybody was talking about day zero. And suddenly we had this new phenomenon that someday we are going to reach a point where there's absolutely no water left. And that was very scary. And it forced us all to implement certain strategies. Some of them were ridiculous. I think the number of liters we had per day was like 50 liters per day per person.
Per household, yeah.
For a Muslim,
Yeah.
That's incredible because wudu, ghusl, istinja and so forth. All of these things require water.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's day zero. Now, the same thing with time. Allah is telling us that your time, albeit for you as an individual or for you as a species, is running out. Qiyamah is coming. Yes, we all know that. And your Qiyamah, your own personal day of departure, right, is also coming. So doesn't it then also make sense that as we did for day zero, put in very, very strict uh, rituals and strategies in order to conserve that which we had, we too should do the same thing. And it's scary. The older you get, the more you realize this, how much time do I really have left? I actually wrote down in my own personal journal, um, based on the World Health Organization estimate of people like me would die at a certain date, how many days I have left, how many years I have left. And I check it every now and then as a reminder to myself that, look, this is it. This is all you have. What are you doing with it?
Yeah.
Just today. What do you, on the day of Qiyamah, when you have to answer for the life that Allah gave you, for the gifts that He had given you, for the mind, for the health, for everything that He has given you, and you need an answer for it, be prepared.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sidi, your thoughts on that and closing remarks, and then we can conclude, inshallah.
So I agree with what you said about, and I like the analogy with day zero, which was, impending drought in Cape Town, South Africa. So, based or in alignment with that, in general, things that are abundant are undervalued, and things that are scarce are valued, right? So, water became very scarce in Cape Town during that time, and just a few short years ago. So we valued water much more, right? So even if you take a shampoo bottle, right? So the shampoo bottle, when it's full, it's abundant, right? So most people waste the first a few times they use it. But when it comes to the last quarter, then you use it sparingly because now it's scarce, right? So same applies with water, same applies with time. If we actually see time as a scarcity, we'll be more prudent with how we use it.
No.
Right? And, we talked earlier about Allah taking an oath by time. We talked about time being a creation of Allah, right? But what's also important to remember is that we will be accountable for our time. So it becomes a responsibility, right? The same with how we spent our wealth, right? We'll be accountable for that. Equally, our time will be held accountable for how we spent it, right? So now it becomes a responsibility, and now we have to relook at how we actually use our time, right? Because Allah wants everything good for us, right? And Allah wants us to use our time productively, right? I would even say that time was created for us to use, right? So I think we have spoken about a few tactics about scheduling and about roles, etc. But in my talks, my primary focus is to give people a new perspective and a new way of thinking, right? So my first request is for people to actually just think about these things and let it sink in, right? And then look at your own life and see how you can apply it. And then you look at how you can be productive and have less anxiety in your day-to-day life, but how you can also achieve great things. So, we look at people like Imam Nawawi, who was a Shafi scholar who did not live very long, but he achieved much, right? And then, apart from the work he put out, there's also barakah in what he achieved, right? So, so when people talk about the Arba'in, we think of the work of Imam Nawawi, right? but many scholars did
Yeah,
40
even
hadith.
though there are probably like thousands of arba'in collections.
So a few years ago, in roughly about 2006 or 7, I was at Habibia Masjid, and as I walked out, there was a few booklets that people could take, and it was arba'in, right? So I took it, assuming it was the arba'in of Imam Nawawi, right? So I just took it, and I got home, and I look at it, and I see it's a different scholar, and I'm confused, right? And then I learned that many scholars have compiled a collection of 40 hadiths based on the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Imam Nawawi is what we attach arba'in to. That's the barakah, right? So he did something different, right? So for example, so I have no clue, but for example, hypothetically, maybe he wrote his arba'in during the tahajjud time, right? So he physically produced the work, but he also had the extra barakah of the actual time he did it. So these things are inshallah important, and then look at what you can achieve in a month and in a year and in a decade for yourself and also for your community. I think inshallah those are useful things to think about and then plan towards, inshallah.
Now, Habib, Jazakumullah khairan. It is a real pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Alhamdulillah.
I hope it's not the last, inshallah.
No. I think inshallah, I think I enjoyed it as well. So we'll make this.
No, absolutely. And also I like the synergy of, sometimes I could perhaps have been exposed to a bit more of the Islamic sciences and so forth that I could also bring to the conversation, and somehow it just always seems to work, alhamdulillah. Anyway, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept, and for my brothers and sisters who are eagerly wanting to improve their time appreciation, their self-management, their time understanding, their time investment, these are all important things. I hope that you've taken a lot of benefit from this discussion, as I have. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitate ease in your goals, dreams, and endeavors. And we hope and pray that you can join us next time. Barakallahu feekum. Sayyidi, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.